Thank you all for being a part of this second session that we have. My name is Marcus Nelson. I am Vice Chair of Needham Select Board, and we want to welcome you to our second session of our Connections, Cops, and Community series. In 2020, the Select Board launched the Needham Unite Against Racism initiative to foster a dialogue about racism and to ensure that Needham is welcoming and inclusive in an inclusive community. The NUARI Working Group was formed to make recommendations and to craft a vision statement for racial equity in Needham. There are copies of the vision statement on each table and can be found at needham.ma.gov/NUARI. The planning of this event came out of NUARI recommendation, which the Select Board has adopted as one of our goals. What did you say? Oh, I thought someone said something. I'm sorry. For one of our goals for this year and beyond, and that's to create a framework for how community members can effectively engage in conversations around race, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to build relationships and a stronger understanding of different perspectives and lived experiences. Policing was identified as one of our key topics. Our hope is that this series will help foster a greater understanding and dialogue between police and the community. So I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to pass it over to Tina. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tina Burgos, and I'm the chair of the Needham Human Rights Committee. I want to acknowledge the members of our planning committee, which included representation from the Select Board, the NUARI Working Group, the Human Rights Committee, the Needham Diversity Initiative, the Police Department, the Needham Public Schools, and town leadership. Specifically, thank you to Raman Abrashamian, Joanne Allen Willoughby, Marion Cooley, Kate Fitzpatrick, Jen Howard, Katie King, Marcus Nelson, Chief John Schlittler, Lisa Smith McQueenie. This group put a lot of thought into how to shape this series. Our first session focused on the history of policing in this country and here in Needham. The recording is available on the Needham Channel's website. Tonight's event is focused on youth and police interactions, with a particular focus on school resource officers. We have added a remote participation option via Zoom. Even 2 years into using Zoom, this still feels like an experiment, so bear with us if we face any technical difficulties. Our third session will be held on Monday, June 13th at 7 p.m. here at Town Hall, and we hope you can join us. Now I will turn it over to Chad Williams, our moderator for the night. Chad is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. He earned a BA with honors in History and African American Studies from UCLA and received both his master's and PhD in History from Princeton University. He specializes in African American and modern United States history. Chad is a published author, a father, and a Needham resident. Chad.
Thank you very much, Tina, for that generous introduction. Good evening, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. I want to acknowledge your presence this evening, especially considering there's a basketball game on later tonight. I think we are going to make sure you're out of here by 8:30, okay? So we can at least get to the first quarter. But we do have some important topics and issues to discuss, and I'm glad that we are all gathered here. Our first event in this series was incredibly informative. There was a lot of information to digest, and we want to make sure with this event we have plenty of time for discussion and engagement, both in person but also virtually as well. And I'd just like to offer the obligatory Zoom reminder for everyone to please keep your microphones muted. Thank you very much. Just give you a sense of our format this evening. I'm going to introduce Professor Warren, who will provide a history of school resource officers and his research on their impacts from a national perspective. Then we'll hear from Newton High School's school resource officer, R.J. Poirier, to learn how our officers and students interact here in Needham. Then we'll break out into small groups for approximately 30 minutes of discussion and reflection. Then I'll ask everyone to come back together as a larger group to share highlights from your conversations before we wrap up for the evening. Sound good? Okay. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Warren. Professor Warren is Professor of Public Policy and Public Affairs at the McCormack Graduate School at University of Massachusetts, Boston. He earned a BA in Social Studies, a Master's in Sociology, and a PhD in Sociology from Harvard University. Mark is a sociologist concerned with the revitalization of American democratic and community life. He studies and works with community and youth organizing groups seeking to promote equity and justice in education, community development, and civic engagement. He's the author of several books, including Fire in the Heart, How White Activists Embrace Racial Justice, and Dry Bones Rattling, Community Building to Revitalize American Democracy. Mark's latest published article argues for the need to address racial and class inequities in public education through the building of a broad-based educational justice movement. So please join me in welcome Professor Mark Warren.
Okay, I'll take this off. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me out to talk with you a little bit tonight for a few minutes. I'm here to talk a little bit about the history impact of school policing from a national perspective. And let me just say right off, I did put school policing there in the title as opposed to school police. And that was pretty intentional because my work, and what I think it's important to understand, is the role of school policing as a systemic factor in public education in this country. It's not a discussion or a judgment about any particular school resource officer or school police officer. It's really more of a discussion of, how do we come to the situation we're in and what's the impact from a national perspective of having policing so prominent in our public education system. I think I have to ask someone to move the slide. So I just want to start off by saying for a second about why we're even talking about school police or school policing. And as Chad said, my work a lot is looking at how community and parent and youth organizing groups organize for racial equity and educational justice. And my latest book is this book, Willful Defiance, which is about the grassroots movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And so by that we mean harsh and racially discriminatory school discipline policies, suspensions and expulsions, and the role of school policing in our schools that serve to push many students, particularly students of color and students with disabilities, out of school and early on into the juvenile and criminal justice system. In 2020, a broad-based protest movement arose around issues of police racism and police abuse, and there were demands to defund and remove police from schools. Most people don't know that there had actually been a very active organizing campaign around issues of school policing that go back at least 20 years in this country. And that movement really laid the basis for, I think, the immersion of demands and the whole concern about what is really the role of school police. Why do we even have police officers and policing in our school system? So one of the very prominent cases that sparked this happened in 2015 in Spring Valley, South Carolina, where a girl, Shakara, black girl, teacher asked her to give up her cell phone. She said she didn't have a cell phone. He said, "I've had enough of you," and he called the vice principal in, who asked her to give up her cell phone, and she said she didn't have one on her, and he said, "I've had enough of you. I'm calling in the school resource officer." And Officer Ben Fields came in. She said she didn't have a cell phone, and he grabbed her, threw her to the floor, and dragged her across the room. It was filmed by another black girl and then and went viral. and the 2 black girls were arrested and charged with criminal count of disrupting school. And, and that really sparked, in some ways, the sort of the organizing campaigns that we saw that really came around in 2021. So I'm just giving that as an example that we're really even having this conversation because I think a lot of particularly black students and families have really raised this issue going back at least 20 years. So let me just say that thinking broadly, in the 1970s, we had very, very few armed security officers in American schools. So we have to realize that this is actually a pretty new phenomenon. And if we only go back literally 40 to 50 years, there were only 100 officers in all schools totally in the country. Only about 1% of U.S. schools had an armed security officer there. By the early 2000s, maybe around 40% of schools had armed security officers, and there were 14,000 plus total officers in our schools. 10 years later, we're now up to about 60% of schools having school resource officers, and they are particularly concentrated in large schools and schools that serve students of color, so majority students of color. So 75% of schools serving majority students of color have armed security officers in them. And this rise has happened at the local, state, and national level. So policy at all levels have supported that. One of the things we'll talk about a little bit is the role that mass shootings in schools played to kind of increase the presence of security officers in schools. And so federal Department of Justice program, Cops in Schools, has funded school resource officers and made funding available. So by 2012, it funded 6,300 school resource officers. By the way, school policing has a variety of ways it's done. Many districts have contracts with their local police to provide officers. Some school districts, particularly large ones like New York City and LA, have their own school police force. The New York City school police force would be the 10th largest police force in the country on its own. And police forces in places like school police in Los Angeles actually have semi-automatic weapons and military-grade equipment, including a tank. And there had to be an organizing campaign by young people to get the school police to return the tank and the military-grade semi-automatic weapons back to the federal government. They received it through the 1033 program. So in the 1970s, we have almost no or very, very few school police. So school police, the presence of police in schools really arose starting in the 80s and particularly in the 90s. And I think it's important to understand that it was part of a larger system of what Michelle Alexander has called the New Jim Crow, in which mass incarceration developed in this country as a phenomenon. In response, many argued to the gains of the civil rights movement and particularly to the uprisings that occurred in black communities in the 60s and 70s. There was a large increase in policing activity in communities, also in schools. The whole idea of zero tolerance in schools arose. The term zero tolerance actually arose in the 1980s in the so-called war on drugs. It was then developed even further in the 90s so that the Clinton crime bill, which has gotten a lot more press as far as how it helped fuel mass incarceration. So all of these ideas of zero tolerance to any forms of misbehavior then entered our schools, and districts after districts started to adopt these discipline practices, which led to very large numbers of suspensions and expulsions, and at the same time, the presence of police in schools. As I mentioned earlier, mass shootings that were tragic and horrible events that happened in schools also fueled the rise of school police, but these shootings typically have happened in more whiter and more ex-urban districts, but the concentration of the presence of armed security officers occurred in more urban districts and in schools serving students of color. So this, I think it's important to understand that this larger system has really played an important role in the perpetuation of poverty in particularly black communities. So if you are black man without a high school degree in this country, your chances of ending up in prison at some point in your life is 2/3. So 2/3 of all black men without a high school degree will end up in prison at some point. 1/3 are in prison or in the criminal justice system at any one time. If you are convicted of a felony in this country, you can legally be discriminated against in employment. You can lose your right to public housing. In many states, you can lose your right to vote. And so the consequences are very severe. Most people don't understand that really in many ways the system of mass incarceration starts in school. The first contact that most black and brown young men in particular have in the criminal justice system happens through their contact with police officers in school. So let me go to the next slide then. By the years 2015 to 16, there were about 61,000 school-based arrests of students and about over 230 school-based referrals to law enforcement. In those years, this not only affects older teenage students, it also actually affects students right down at the elementary school. So as I say here, between 2013 and 2018, 30,000 students under the age of 10 were arrested in this country. Students who have been arrested are 50% less likely to graduate to high school than those who have never been arrested, which is part of this school-to-prison pipeline idea that if you are arrested in school, you can go right into the juvenile justice system, but you're also less likely to graduate high school. And again, if you're a black male, that makes you more likely to end up long-term in the criminal justice system. There actually is no evidence that the presence of armed security officers makes schools or students safer. There isn't any. People who have compared, or scholars who have compared schools with armed security officers to schools without, don't find any reductions in violence at those schools. What the evidence shows is that schools that have SROs in them increases the contact students have with police. Those schools have higher arrest rates and higher referral law enforcement rates. They have also higher rates of suspension, and they also have higher rates of chronic absenteeism. And generally, what scholars find is that the presence of police in schools shifts the attention of the school from teaching and learning towards disciplinary and punitive and criminalization practices. And the reality is that in schools that have armed security officers, police are mostly called to handle routine disciplinary matters, things like disorderly conduct or misbehavior, the kinds of behavior that would not be considered a crime or cause for police intervention should they occur outside of a school environment. So could we have the next slide? Right, so just wanted to give you some evidence about so you can see with the blue schools are the schools with school resource officers, and the orange are those without, and you can see that the arrest rates are much higher in schools with SROs, and you can also see that the vast majority of arrests or charges when students are arrested were for things like disorderly conduct. Assault is there, it's a fairly low number, and weapons charges are very small. So this then takes us to the issue of disparities in school policing. So this is widely supported by the evidence. Black students are about 4 times as likely to be arrested or referred to law enforcement than white students. It doesn't only affect males, so in sheer numbers, it's more black males or Latinx males, but black girls are also arrested actually at 4 times the rate of white girls. And this also affects students with disabilities, so the intersection of race and disability. Black and Latino boys with disability are only 3% of students, but make up fully 12% of all school arrests. LGBTQ students are also twice as likely to be arrested as those who are not. and I think we'll take the next slide too. So this is a lot more detail for those who are interested. It tries to predict the overrepresentation. What it's really showing you is that particularly black students are heavily overrepresented in a range of disciplinary issues: out-of-school suspensions, in-school suspensions, referrals to law enforcement, expulsions, corporal punishment, and school-based, school-related arrests. So this is very heavily impacting our black students, and and white students are overwhelmingly underrepresented in those numbers. Okay, so misplaced priorities. So what we are facing is a situation where, you know, our society has invested large amounts of money in law enforcement and disciplinary measures, and not in the kinds of supports that may be really helping our students. So we now have a situation where, as I say up here, 1.7 million students in this country attend schools that have armed security officers but no counselors. And you can read them all: 3 million with police but no nurses, 6 million with police but no school psychologists, 10 million students attend schools with police officers but no social workers. And this, again, is racialized, so black students are 3 times more likely than white students to attend schools with more armed security officers than mental health personnel. And so I think we're also seeing with the impact of the pandemic and the trauma that a lot of young people are facing, and their families and their communities and schools, they're going back to schools, and often those schools are not investing in support structures for those young people, and instead are using systems of discipline and criminalization. So this is my last slide, because I know I'm not supposed to talk too long. So we do have alternatives to school policing, and we can invest in student supports so that students are getting counseling and mental health services. We can also invest in or develop restorative practices or positive behavioral interventions and supports using circles or peer mediation. But I would also say that we often focus on those issues, and I think we are right to do so, but I think we also need to realize that SROs are really only dealing with actually critical behavioral problems in a small number of cases. They're actually mainly being called in for minor behavioral issues, students refusing to give up a cell phone or other kinds of things. So I think while students need support and investment in that, we also need to think about a larger transformation of our public education system into creating more welcoming, safe, and humane environments for all of our students. So we need to think about issues of culturally relevant curriculum, including the voices of parents and students of color and relationships with them in our schools, creating inclusive spaces for students of color and trans and queer students, and also thinking about the teaching about history and structural racism. So again, I end on that note because I think that while we are here to focus particularly on the issue of school policing, I think it's important to understand it in this larger systemic issue of the ways in which I think our public education system is failing, particularly low-income students of color. And those failures particularly happen in places where there are large concentrations of low-income students of color, but we also know that students of color do less well and are often sometimes failed in more affluent, whiter school districts where they are a minority of those students. So thank you for listening to me for a few minutes. I'm happy to take some questions, I think. Questions or comments?
We have some time built in for questions. So if you have anything that you would like to comment on or raise with Professor Warren, please feel free to.
Yes, go ahead. Ma'am, please.
Thank you. This is a very stimulating, thought-provoking presentation. I wonder if there are any studies of comparing school systems that had similar demographics, but some had the school police officers and some didn't?
Yes, so the studies that I was quoting aren't comparing districts, but they are looking at schools. So they are controlling for race and economics and other issues. So yes, so they do take that into consideration, but so I'm not sure exactly. So in terms of like the issue of whether they make schools safer or whether students of color are disproportionately impacted. So those really are studies that compare schools rather than school districts per se, if that makes sense. No, if I didn't answer your question, go ahead.
Are there any, for instance, large cities that decided not to have the school police officers?
Well, there are now.
Yeah, and how they were, these alternatives that you talked about, are there some examples where that has worked differently with the consequences that we're seeing where in the other parts of your presentation?
Yes. So to be honest, they're pretty new. So there's not a long-term evidence base to look at. But for example, the Oakland School District, which is a very large school district, has entirely removed police officers and SROs from schools. And they've adopted a kind of wholesale set of alternatives that include restorative practices, greater investments in student supports, and a high level of parent and community and student participation in their schools. This actually happened because a group called the Black Organizing Project started organizing to remove police from schools back in 2012. They actually declared the goal of removing police from Oakland schools within 10 years. At that time, they were told they were crazy. We'll never, you can't even raise the issue. We're never going to remove police from schools, but they were able to do that. So there are about 130 districts passed resolutions in 2020 to 21 to remove the police officers from schools. Not all of those actually did it. And so Oakland is a good example of a large district that did it, but Denver moved in that direction. Some have now brought in so-called school safety officers, so they're using different names. So it's hard for me to comment exactly on what's happened in many of those places. Yeah.
Sorry, after you, there's one question on Zoom. I was interested to know if you could talk a little bit about the history of desegregation in schools and how that lines up with policing in schools as well. You know, when I was listening to you talk about the 70s and 80s, that was when we were seeing school systems create.
Yeah, so I think that some people have argued that the rise of school police came in response to desegregation successes. And I think certainly timeline-wise, that is absolutely true. So this larger system of the school-to-prison pipeline and the larger system of the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, scholars have understood to be a new form of racial control. And so in many ways, the old Jim Crow or the legal segregation system, both in the South and in the North, worked to keep black communities and black students in segregated schools. With the gains of the civil rights movement, with the gains of desegregation, this new wave of racial control was put in its place, and that's how it's understood. So I think there's a composite of factors. I didn't stress desegregation because, I mean, with all these, you can make the temporal argument. I think you can make an analytical case. It's hard to directly tie the two, but I think we can tie things like zero tolerance that arose in the 80s and the bills that were passed by the Clinton crime bill and other bills that were passed, the federal Guns in School Act, I'm not getting the exact name right, that was passed in the 1990s, all are clear evidence of a move towards school policing. Yeah. And I guess there's a Zoom question.
Online put their hand down, so
Oh, okay. Sure, sir, over there.
Definitely very interesting. So between the Needham Police and Needham Public Schools, there's a memorandum of understanding that's a fairly lengthy document that outlines all of the conditions, et cetera. And I just wonder if you have opportunity to kind of study, do certain structures that are in place that define the role, how does that impact some of the things that you're reporting on up there in terms of being involved in discipline-related things or other kinds of things? I don't know if I'm clear about that.
Yeah. Well, I think that to be honest with you, I'm not really an expert on the various kinds of MOUs that have been signed. So these are usually when school departments contract with the local police. They often sign a memorandum of understanding which outlines the circumstances in which police or officers are meant to intervene. Also, how many there'll be and who they'll be. I mean, typically, school resource officers are either off-duty, or sometimes retired police officers, people who've been trained usually to be regular police officers. That's another issue. They very seldom get specific training in how to relate to young people, issues of social emotional development, and all that. Although, again, individual SROs might be quite supportive of some students too. So that's why I'm trying to make a distinction there, not cast a broad net out against all individuals. So it seems like whatever the MOUs are, that once SROs are placed in schools, then the evidence seems to be that they then get in, because just by their mere practice of being there, are then relied upon and called in for disciplinary actions, usually for behavioral issues, not necessarily, I mean, what we're thinking about is guns and violence and fights, but that still remains a very small percentage in any school of what SROs are actually spending their time doing. And I will say, by the way, on the mass shootings issue, it's because that has often been given as a justification for increasing police presence. There aren't that many, fortunately, mass shootings, so we can't really look statistically at that. But it appears to be that, unfortunately, mass shooters will enter schools and kill people whether there are SROs there or not. So there's a number of cases, very well-known cases, where there were, like the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School case, where there was SRO in the school and wasn't able, and there have actually been no cases where an SRO has been able to prevent a mass school shooting, unfortunately. So in any way, the conclusion there is that the presence of armed security officers doesn't, unfortunately, deter or prevent a school shooting.
So I think that's a perfect opportunity to transition to our next speaker, one of our school resource officers. Please. And Professor Warren will be with us for the rest of the evening, and please feel free to address him with any other questions that you may have. It's my pleasure to next introduce R.J. Poirier, who has served as a police officer for the past 14 years. He joined the Needham Police Department in 2018 and has worked in the role of school resource officer for the last 3 years. He is a graduate of Needham High School, a Marine Corps veteran, and holds a BA from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and an MBA from Babson College. So, RJ.
Hey everybody, how's it going? It's good to see everybody here. Am I gonna have to bend over the whole time for this microphone? It's good to see everybody here. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces, both students and people that I recognize around town. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So I'm just going to go through real quickly and just talk to you guys about what we do in Needham, at least as school resource officers. First of all, I'm one of the school resource officers. I've been at the high school for the last 3 years. There's a second school resource officer as well. She's in the crowd. It's Nicole Mcmahon. And Nicole's been in the schools for about 1.5 years. Nicole always leaves me to do presentations. I'm trying to get her to speak more, so hopefully we'll have her speak soon. The first thing I just want to say is I've been a police officer in Needham for the past 4 years, only 4 years, but prior to that, I worked in Wellesley, which I know is the enemy, and so the chief was gracious enough to bring me over to Needham to come back and work in the town that I grew up in, and then gave me the opportunity to work as a school resource officer at the high school that I graduated from. I'm a Needham High graduate, and it meant so much for me to get that opportunity to go back to the school and to work with students. So the last 3 years have been an absolute pleasure for me. By the way, when I got chosen to be the school resource officer, when Nicole got chosen to be the school resource officer, it wasn't, it wasn't some sort of just process without thought. The process, the selection process is a thoughtful and thorough process at the Needham Police Department. And I think that says something about what the chief is trying to do with the school resource officer program. And, I think it's important for the students and for the staff at the schools within Needham as well. I do know that, in some other police departments around the country, and even in Massachusetts, there's not quite a thorough selection process. And so, you might have a police officer that's sort of just, looking maybe for an easier assignment, although I'd argue that it's not quite an easy assignment. And basically someone that's going to go there for the wrong reasons. The work that you do at the school, it's very important work. I personally believe that the work that the police department does within the community with youth both at school and outside of school is the most important work we can do. So I think it's important to have a thorough selection process and make sure the right person is doing this job. I not only went to Needham High, but I live in Needham now, and my son goes to Needham School. So being a parent in town, I truly care about what's going on in the school system. And so it gives me, the drive and ambition to go to work every day and make sure all our students are doing well and are in a safe environment to learn. Next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, there's 2 school resource officers. We've been introduced. This is just a quick breakdown of our schools in Needham. I'm just, in case some of you are not from Needham, I am primarily assigned to the high school. Nicole is primarily assigned to the rest of the schools you see here. And so Nicole, with that, bounces around and checks into the various other schools. You can see that I listed 2 private schools here as well, because we do support those schools. We're in there, responding and helping them out with various things, teaching classes, and supporting their students as well. We're primarily in Needham Public Schools, though. And, besides that, you might find us over helping out some of the preschools, schools associated with the temples. We've been in there to help them with various things, too. So we're around town quite a few places, I should say. Next slide. Okay, so the MOU was brought up. I'm glad it was brought up. I think it's an important thing to bring up. So the Memorandum of Understanding, so it's a document that formalizes and clarifies implementation of the partnership between the school district and the police department. It also provides clarification within the relationship of the school resource officer and the school itself. So in my case, the high school, but then all the other schools as well. As you see the mission statement, goals, and objectives up here, just going to read this real quick so everybody hears this. The mission is to facilitate relationship building by the SRO such that students, faculty, staff, and community members see the SRO as contributing to a positive school climate. This will be realized by supporting and fostering the safe and healthy development of all students in the district through strategic and appropriate use of law enforcement resources, and with a mutual understanding that school participation and completion are indispensable to achieving positive outcomes for youth and public safety. Why the MOU is so important here is because it shapes a relationship that could look different than, you know, the relationship between schools and the police and other towns within this state, and certainly outside of this state, schools, you know, in other states. The MOU, you know, also could be a different, or could read differently outside of Needham. In this town, my position, Nicole's position, is funded by the police department. You know, you might travel down to Georgia and find that the school resource officer position is funded, you know, partially by the school district and by the police department, and there's sort of different agreements on that. And so when you see those different avenues of funding, you might see different roles and responsibilities for school resource officers, and those might be outlined in an MOU if they have one. I think, next slide, sorry. What I really wanted to highlight here within the MOU is what I'm about to read. It's important to hear. So under state law, the SRO shall not serve as school disciplinarian, enforcer of school regulations, or in place of licensed school psychologists, psychiatrists, or counselors, or use police powers to address traditional school discipline issues, including nonviolent disruptive behavior. So that would include taking a cell phone from a kid that doesn't want to give his cell phone up. You know, in Massachusetts, you know, we have progressive police departments. We have police reform that's been ongoing and is evolving. You know, disorderly conduct, disrupting a school assembly, those things don't exist in Massachusetts. Police officers, they're not crimes at schools. So police officers cannot and will not react to such things. Those would be considered school discipline issues, and those are things that the school resource officer does not get involved with. Now, could we be, you know, available to support the staff, to support the students around those things? Yes, but, you know, we're not throwing kids to the ground because they're acting disorderly. That just doesn't happen in Massachusetts. It shouldn't happen in Massachusetts, and it's not happening in the Needham School District. Next slide. So the training that a school resource officer goes through is quite extensive. To become a school resource officer, and this is mandated by the state now with police reform, you must have a 40-hour SRO training course. This is the basic course you need. Year to year, you're required to complete annual training, just like teachers do. Teachers go back and do annual training. And so some of the things that I've listed here, over to this side, you'll see the 40-hour SRO training course, and you'll see some things that we've done over the past couple of years is specialized training within sort of the school resource officer training realm. On the other side, you'll see what we're required to do, mandatory, which mirrors what police officers in general are required to do in the state. And then below that, you'll see additional training around use of force, defensive tactics, active shooter, stuff like that. The training that we do for school resource officer, it's been great to go through some of these courses for me. I've been a police officer for a little over 14 years now, and these trainings, weren't available to me as a police officer prior to becoming an SRO. The one thing that I did get trained in prior to becoming an SRO, and Nicole is also certified in it, is in crisis intervention, and responding to a person that might be going through a mental health crisis. I'm trained both in adult CIT as well as juvenile CIT. All our officers are trained in mental health first aid as well. But some of the training that we've done within the school resource officer category has been great. It's been eye-opening. It's been helpful as far as for me to understand the students at the school, the goals of Needham schools. And so, we look forward to continuing to have the opportunity to continue with some of this training. Next slide, please. All right. So, I've been a police officer for over 14 years. I've been a police officer in Needham for 4 years. I've been in the school for 3 years. I've never put handcuffs and arrested a juvenile in Needham, not in the school, not out of the school. I tell the kids at school, if they, some might come up to me and joke and say, "Can I put on your handcuffs?" I tell them, "Look, I'm here to keep you out of trouble, not to get you in trouble." And I mean that when I say that. I mean that both as a police officer, and I mean that, being a dad in this town. I think the worst thing that could happen is for a kid to get arrested. And I think that there's a million other things we can do than go down that path that would be much better for the youth in question. Within my time as a school resource officer, there has been very, very few matters of youthful offender situations. Within that, there have been even less that have gone to court. We generally at the Needham Police Department try to keep kids out of juvenile court. We don't believe it's a good path at all. There's some times when it's unavoidable depending on the particular behavior that we're looking at or offense. And of course, victim consideration comes into that as well. We at the Needham Police Department have a diversion program. Officer Katie McCullough is the juvenile court liaison, and Sari Mussman is the youth diversion program coordinator. I was going to ask Katie real quick, who's in the crowd, and Sari, if you want to just talk about that really quickly. It's been a successful program for us, and Katie can speak to it much better than I can. How am I? Thanks. Okay. hey, you got 2 seconds because I have to wrap up.
I apologize, I'm not prepared. Like RJ said, I'm Officer Katie McCullough. I'm a patrol officer here in Needham, and in a smaller community like that, we wear many hats. One of my hats is also the juvenile court liaison, diversion coordinator. Back in 2018, as I was working the courts, if a youthful offender came to us with charges or an arrest, I would process it through the courts. And we found that it wasn't very effective, it wasn't meaningful, and it wasn't impactful. So we started the Diversion Program. In lieu of these charges, what Sari and I do is we do an intake with the offender. We go over what the charges are, and instead of court actions, we sign a contract with them. They're usually on a 3 to 6 or 1 year contract, depending on the offense. The parents are involved. The parents have stipulations that they can add to the contract. Oftentimes, there's letters of apology, letters of acknowledgement, community service, restitution, and we keep them on a probationary period, and we keep it in-house. And by in-house, I mean all the services are offered through Needham. We'll make referrals to Needham Youth and Family Services if we think that counseling is in order. If it involves drugs or alcohol, they will take the Youth and Family Services Substance Abuse Prevention Program. We team up with Riverside. We have a Riverside clinician in the department with us. So it's really all-encompassing. It's not just take the kid to court and, now you're going to have a record. Since we started in 2018, almost every single offender has been processed through the Diversion Program, as opposed to we've had one juvenile arrest in the last 2.5 years. It was a more serious offense, something that we could not appropriately deal with, and there was a victimology that we had to consider. So I do the intake with the family. I hand it over to my coordinator here, Sari, who does bi-weekly check-ins with the family. And she's tough. She's tougher than me, actually, so I'd like to bring her in.
Being part of the program.
She's very thorough. She can speak to some of the things that you have the juveniles doing while they're under contract with us.
So once we put a contract together, or as part of the contract, as Officer McCullough was saying, we set up community service, or we have the students themselves set up community service, hopefully within Needham, sometimes in other areas, depending on what their transgression was. Try and make some meaningful connection there. Somewhere between 12 and 24 hours is what we usually require for community service, and we check up on that and make sure that is done. We have them write letters of apology, we have them write letters of reflection, and they have to come and meet with me every other week, which is really fun and inconvenient for everybody. But I really see a difference in the students as they come through, and a connection. They really start to get a connection with the police officers as well, coming to the police station for these regular meetings, which is fantastic, because a lot of the students then know that they are being seen when they're out in town. And getting to know the families as well. So it's really a fantastic program that the police department has put together, and I think that it's making a difference in the town.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Next slide. All right. So if I'm not, going into the school and can I, like, a couple minutes? I can have a couple minutes. Come on. All right. So I just want to. So if so what are we doing in the schools? We are there as school resource officers to bridge the gap between home life and school life. When kids come to school, they're walking down the hallways and they're trying to go to school. They're trying to, get through with all the pressures that they have going on. And as you look at students, you don't know what might be going on in their lives. You might not know what's going on in their households. School resource officers are there in a way that, uniquely other people can't be. We've unfortunately been to homes where students have relatives who have committed suicide. We're in homes where there's domestic violence. We're in homes where there's a lot of things going on mental health issues. And then we're in school together. And, you know, Needham schools have wonderful counselors, a very, very supportive school. And, you know, it's a pleasure to be in the school as a school resource officer, to communicate with those counselors and to communicate with the students and to be there to support them and encourage them. You know, when you see Nicole and I in the hallways of Needham High School, we're checking in with kids, we're listening. And some of the stuff that's up here just kind of details what we do with the kids, you know, helping them out with rides to school, helping them out in cases where they couldn't afford something, to try to raise some money to get them some things that they need, helping with tutoring. We run a police academy for middle school students, and we teach them about policing. And we're in the schools teaching classes, Fourth Amendment classes, social media safety classes, domestic violence, self-defense, doing a lot of things with the students, both in and outside of school, a lot of outside school events, and trying to be there as, you know, another supportive, positive influence in their lives. I think I can cut it off there if you want me to. Nicole knows I can talk all day, so. And I just want to say, too, you know, we really, the police department, it's up there on a slide, but I'll just show. We really, especially in our roles as school resource officers, we partner with organizations like SPAN, the YMCA, Needham Youth and Family Services, and Needham Park and Rec, and try to support and help programs that are positive for the kids. And in return, they provide a lot of support for us to help us make or be successful. So thank you, guys. Thank you for listening. Thanks.
Sorry. All right. Thank you, RJ. And if you have any specific questions for RJ, I think during our Q&A period and during our report out session after our small group discussions would be the appropriate time to do that. But we do want to move on to the next phase of our program, and I'm going to turn things over to Katie, who is going to explain our breakout discussion thing. All right.
Great. Hi, everyone. Great to see everyone in person and on Zoom. I just wanted to let you know how this is going to run since we're trying this hybrid style. So for folks who are watching on Zoom right now, Cindy Roy Gonzalez is running across the hall to her computer, and she will be joining you to facilitate your breakout, and we are going to actually disconnect the feed from that breakout room and this one, and then we'll reconnect folks literally later. So in this room here, every table has a facilitator. If you could raise your hand, and just let folks know. And so they'll walk you through some prompt questions, and this really is just a time for reflection. So we're going to report back, come all back together at 8:30. I'll give a 5-minute warning, and we're going to ask each group to report out just one thing before we wrap for the night. Thanks.
Believe me, as a professor, I love to see students talking and engaging. The worst thing to do is break up good conversations, but alas, duty calls. So we're going to engage in our kind of report out sessions, and I want to start with the Zoom rooms and anything that's come out of those conversations.
Great, thanks. So I'm Cindy Roy Gonzalez. I had the Zoom room. In the interest of time, I will just report 2 quick things. So the first thing that was interesting was the fact that, so I had question number 6, question number 1, what is the differential impact of incorporating police in a school or education community? And so the point that a couple of folks made was that, to RJ's point about how officers, school resource officers, may have experience with families and then see those same kids in the schools, it can be both potentially positive and negative. So even if the student has a really great relationship with the school resource officer, seeing that officer who may have been in their home for some negative issue in the school may be a challenge for that student. And so they may bring sort of a different perspective. But that being said, they may also have a really wonderful interaction with the school resource officer at their home, and may, when they are in the school, feel more safe because that school resource officer is there. And then just quickly, one other point that was made, there was discussion about the need to have a lot of the services provided to the students that our school resource officers provide, particularly around issues of mental health. But the question was whether there is someone who is not a police officer who can still fill that role, but it has to be someone that has a sort of different level of responsibility or respect than, say, a teacher or an administrator, but not yet clear on really who that person would be besides a police officer. So, thank you.
Great. Why don't we just go around to each table, starting with table number 1 here. Hi, how you doing? Good to see you.
Okay, well, so actually I think the thing that we started with and ended with was a question about how do we measure success of both the school resource officer and their impact in the schools. And how, I think a question that we all had was, how did we get here? How did we even start having police officers in the school? And then how do we plan to work with intention around all of these issues rather than just falling into a routine? Because we know that the statistics that were mentioned are statistics that are reflected here in Needham, even though we all work with the best intention. So moving forward, just planning what happens.
Great. I don't know, do we have an answer to that question? When was this first school resource officer introduced? I don't know.
I think it was 2004.
2004. Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, table number 2.
Okay. I'm going to just cut down to a couple of important points because we're a very verbal table. And we start off with question 2, and folks at the table acknowledge that that we don't want to speak for students, and we don't want to speak for students of color. And so we talked about some of the survey material that's coming out, that actually students were surveyed today in our schools using a panorama, and hopefully that will help us understand the sense to which our students of color and the idea of one set of students that are part of the students of color is also something we very much challenged and took apart in terms of not making there's a large group of very diverse individuals within that group, so being very clear about that. So hoping to bring that forward. Also, it becomes very important to have focus groups where we're talking to students directly, where we're hearing from them directly, not just relying on survey data. We also heard a lot about the diversion program and how it really came out of a decision by the state of Massachusetts to decriminalize kind of youth behavior and using a diversion program in order to provide higher levels of support. As was mentioned earlier, I think the very, very few students are being arrested and going to court because of the diversion program. The other piece we jumped on a little bit is regarding how do we recognize and mitigate any disparities with regard to emotional mental health costs for students of color in Needham Public Schools, and one of the things we talked about is the real lack of diversity, whether it's among counselors or other staff, in terms of creating a much more comfortable and kind of experience where you feel like you're talking to someone who may have a much better chance of understanding your experience and your background, is not making judgments based on how you look to them, and that's a really important key part of moving forward with that. So, and one of the things we also talked about was kind of the changes over time of the Needham Police Department in terms of moving from a very aggressive arrest system a number of years ago into a place where that's no longer the most important piece, and how the SRO enables many students to have early experiences with police, you know, whether it's Nicole or RJ or Katie, where, you know, they're getting to know them as people, and hopefully that is helping them develop as they grow a better relationship and less fear in terms of the police. And also what connected to that is often young people will express a desire to talk to RJ or Nicole and not another police officer when they encounter them. And that's a really interesting aspect of what the SRO system creates for us.
Right. Thank you. All right. Yeah. Table 3.
Okay. We had question 3. We took it from the point of view of the students. And the first thing we acknowledged was that the students are not in a vacuum. National situations versus local situations, the national situations matter. A longer history versus a recent local experiences still matter to the students. We decided that how we respond changes the situation. We must acknowledge, validate, and that's the first step of mental health, encourage a sense of safety. And then finally we thought that perhaps a skill of calling in, how to reach out and how to talk to all groups would be of value. Thanks.
Right. In the back, table 4.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. So our table was talking about the role of a school resource officer in leading to an increased sense of belonging for all students. And that led to a couple of interesting conversations. First was the realization that for the parents at the table, they really didn't understand the role of a school resource officer at all, and didn't understand what that person was doing in the schools. So understanding what the role did was huge, and they thought that was something that actually should be part of the regular education process for parents somehow at each of the schools. We also had an interesting discussion about why RJ and Nicole, the officers, carry a gun in schools. And from a parent's perspective, that was quite off-putting. From our sample of one at our table, from Chad's son, Michael, okay, Michael said he actually didn't notice the gun because he was busy looking at Rocket. So, you know, so it's a matter of perspective. And to the kids, it seemed more it was just the person with the dog as opposed to a police officer carrying a gun. So again, there was that little difference in perception with how something was being handled. We also talked about the critical role of building trust, particularly with families of color. And that again got to another discussion about maybe there's particular outreach to those families at school to talk about the role of SROs so that they understand that the SRO is not part of discipline, right? Because there's a concern that that is their purpose there, and how they fit within the overall picture and how they might be helpful to families and to children really in the town. The last thing that I think was interesting at our table was the realization we had a discussion about the fact that RJ was quite connected to our community, right? Grew up here, lives here, his children are in school here. It was new information that all police officers in town have a significant connection to our community. And even with the decision on the part of town meeting that was just made to leave civil service to support doing that, that there will still be a significant connection to our community. That actually was quite reassuring to the parent at the table because it helped to set a sense that the person who's in the schools has a real sense of how this community operates and how we like to treat each other, and that gave more confidence to how their child might be treated in that instance.
Great, thank you very much. Table 5.
Okay. Our question was, how might the students of color and the white students experience having a police present in their school differently? We have a very diverse group, which was great. So one aspect that came out of the conversation was historical association. You know, there might be an ethical distrust of the police, even though not necessarily a direct, a negative experience with the police because of what you're experiencing through media, what your friends are talking about, based on observation. And that sort of leads to distrust, which is, Marianne, what you had touched upon, and how do we sort of get past that? Another point that was made was about discussions that BIPOC parents have with their children versus the conversations that white parents have with their children regarding interacting with police. What does that look like? And we, you know, kind of went around the table and talked about different experiences that we've had with police interaction. You know, Marcus talked about particularly his experiences as a youth and how it's affected his perception, you know, into adulthood. And the last thing that I wanted to mention, which is sort of something that I observed generally across all of the different conversations that we were having, and again, Marianne had touched upon this, is a misunderstanding about the police, the connection between police and the community. And I think there needs to be, from my perspective, more transparency, more education and more communication between the department and, you know, what the community thinks is sort of happening versus what the reality of it is.
Mm-hmm. And I think just one more thing to add, just making sure that the intention is matching the impact. And when that's not happening, things go by the wayside and we have, you know, unwarranted or unwanted communication. And I think making sure that we try to put that at the forefront is really, really, really powerful to make sure that that is something that is talked about, something that is practiced and put into action.
Thank you. Last table, number 6.
Cynthia, I thought for sure you would take this. The question was, what community values are reflected in the decision to have a police officer present in the middle and high schools? Considering the non-law enforcement functions of the SRO, why not utilize an extra social worker or counselor or student advocate? And we had a really interesting conversation about what classrooms might look like where there was not a police present, where there maybe were behavior issues that felt like they needed a little something extra in the classroom or in the school. We also talked about the number of the functions that the SROs are playing are not things that existing school counselors or teachers or administrators have the capacity to do, especially a lot of the direct outreach out into people's homes and into different parts of the community because they're tied to the building. To me, what the value I think that I took away from our conversation is that as a community, we've decided that we want to create a situation where the students in Needham Public are able to make some mistakes without facing the extraordinary circumstances of being tied to the criminal justice system. And this is highlighted in particular with the Diversion Program that's been created and how useful that is to the community here. Anybody want to add anything else? Okay.
Great. Well, we are short on time, but I just wanted to provide anybody opportunity to respond to any of the other tables or comments that have been raised. Some really excellent observations. Clearly the conversations were incredibly fruitful. Any questions, comments, reflections on anything that's been raised? Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. So the question I had, I don't know who should answer it, is just the what was presented and what the school resource officer does is different than my one experience that I had, where I was contacted by the SRO, I want to say 4 years ago, so probably before RJ was there. At the time, one of my kids had been a victim of a cyberbullying. I was aware of it, but I didn't call the school or call the police. But someone had told, I guess, the SRO that my son had been a victim, and someone else had been a victim, and they were trying to collect evidence. And that does not seem like what you said the SRO does. It does not seem like what that state law of should not be doing discipline for the school. It seems like something that in our day the principal would have dealt with, or a counselor. So that just surprised me, and maybe this policy has changed since then. But that, and the student who was the accused of doing, who did it, the student who was cyberbullying, was a student of color. So I don't know who.
Bullying is a crime, and that's probably why it was referred that way. It doesn't mean that there's going to be criminal activity, but if it is a crime, usually the school will consult with the SRO, and if they gather the information, there's several steps they could do. We've talked about diversion. We've talked about, quite frankly, when the school takes disciplinary action, a lot of times it has more teeth than the courts could ever do. So when you gather the information and get that information, make a decision, the SROs consult with the school, and they come up with the best appropriate action, whether it be diversion, whether it be handled by the school. But bullying is a crime, and that's probably why it was handled that way.
Right. Any other last questions, comments? No, definitely a lot to process. I don't know, Katie, do you have any other comments? No? All right, well, we're actually ending pretty much on time, so kudos to all of us. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. Thank you everyone who participated virtually on Zoom. Please make sure to mark your calendars, June 13th, for our next and final program in this series. And big shout out to Marcus again for spearheading this initiative. Great. Well, thank you everyone, and hope you have a good evening.